So the question becomes, should Roy get tested for Alzheimer's? And suppose that he discovers that he has two copies of the inherited gene. What is he going to do with that information? And the same is true of Maria Lopez. She gets tested for genetic predisposition to diabetes. What is it that she's going to do with that information? So let's talk with regard to genetic testing now, some of the ethical issues. One is the question of disease prevention. So for some of these genetic diseases, no matter what people do, they're going to get the disease. The breast cancer 1 and breast cancer 2 mutations are autosomal dominant genes. And these genetic diseases, like Huntington's, are that you can live typical healthy lives and not get the disease, or you can still get the disease. In the case of the breast cancer genes, double mastectomy might be the only option because there aren't really lifestyle changes that a person can do. There's been some correlations with developing breast cancer or avoiding the development of breast cancer and some dietary changes, minimal research, but you can't really prevent it from happening. So having this genetic testing done and then getting the preventive measures may be the only option. Whereas, something like diabetes is a little more complex. And, we have to consider whether Maria is responsible for getting diabetes. She's not. We know that with diabetes, there are lifestyle changes that can be made that can help stave off the development or even prevent the development of diabetes or prolong when it actually starts. So, is she responsible for developing the disease? Or, 1 in 5 people in Harlem have it. What is the environmental risk that she's under? Given Roy's 2 copies of the gene, is there much that he can do to avoid Alzheimer's? But evidence suggests that things like drinking alcohol can accelerate the decline of people with this gene. So he could make lifestyle changes. So, can getting these genetic tests done help to prolong or prevent the development of the disease? Testing can also be for self-benefit. Are people going through this testing as kind of a self-interest? In the 1960s, a lot of women under the age of 50 with breast cancer elected to have bilateral mastectomies to remove both cancerous and precancerous tissues from their breasts. But later studies revealed that that radical of a surgery wasn't necessary. So they were having this testing and all of these things done even before the finalization of identifying the gene was done. They're still having the testing done and taking action based on the preliminary results of this genetic testing. So everything is complicated, and you have to assess why is it that people are doing these. If these women have these mutations in the breast cancer gene, the benefits of knowing early are that you can take measures possibly to reduce a risk of having breast cancer, ovarian cancer, such as taking birth control pills or other methods. And similarly, testing for genes that increase the likelihood of getting diabetes could lead to benefits for people like Maria Lopez if she could adopt a healthier lifestyle, or for her daughters who have an even better chance of developing a healthier lifestyle. Testing for Alzheimer's could lead to some benefits. So, having this genetic testing done can not only possibly prevent the disease, but also be in the best interest of the individual having the test. Now, some people want to undergo this genetic testing because they want the good news. They take the genetic testing. They're not really, or are they really understanding what it is that they're doing? They are taking this test in some cases to find out they don't have a gene rather than to find out that they do. People they want to do it as a way to rule out the fact that they may have a particular gene. So, the self-knowledge is seldom perfect. You can't predict how a person is going to react to bad news, like testing positive for a terrible genetic condition. Because diseases like Huntington's and Alzheimer's can't be cured, a positive test is going to tell a person that they're going to die a terrible death. And not everyone can deal with this kind of knowledge. Like Nancy Wexler said, for some people, particularly teenagers or young adults, this knowledge can be toxic and can absolutely warp their lives. It definitely has an effect on their long-term lives. And then when little treatment is available, is it wise to give people such a diagnosis? Are these people being burdened with more truth than they can bear? So we really need to have studies done to look at the long-term impact of having this knowledge at a relatively early age. However, on the opposite side, testing for genes like breast cancer or diabetes allows that early intervention that we talked about. So again, that's one of the ethical issues. There's also the concept of testing as a duty to, and particularly to a family, knowing that one is likely to have a genetic fate isn't just on the person, it's on the person's family. It's embedded within families. Many of these cases, they have children, they have parents. So knowing that information, they often feel like, well, I don't want to know for myself, but I need to know for my family. And, there are options for doing that they've come out with. Some people are doing things like having the testing done and not getting the results, but putting it away in a safe deposit box so that the family can later on decide to look at it if something happens to the individual. So it's hard to say, you don't want to know the news, but you feel a responsibility to do it for your family because your family deserves the news. And not only for, descendants, blood relatives that are possibly going to get the disease, but also a spouse who has to be able to prepare for the eventuality of a chronic disease that they're going to be caring for. It allows the family to be able to prepare financially and emotionally, the physical space that they're in. All of those things are considerations that some people would prefer to plan for. So then also another ethical issue is the personal responsibility issue. So, going back to Roy and Maria, can they do anything to prevent getting those diseases? So I think we've talked about that. I don't think we need to go into a lot more detail about that. But one that is important is sick identities. And we've touched on this a little bit, but knowing that you have a particular disease that you're going to develop at some point in your life, kind of puts you into this sick identity. You, even before you start having symptoms from it, you develop a sick identity. For example, if you're going to get Huntington's, and you know that you're going to get it, there's nothing you can do about it, you identify yourself as sick, or you may identify yourself as sick long before you are. People are highly suggestible. So if they're, one of the things that becomes a concern is suicide, and, looking at, you're testing, say, a teenager in a population that they're already highly suicidal. Now I find out that they have the gene for Huntington's or breast cancer, and they agonize about things like the long-term implications of the cost and where they're going to be and relationships and all of that. So the question is, should adolescents be genetically tested, and who is going to get the answer, and what, although lifestyle changes can happen, are you also setting up this potential for a sick identity and the potential for suicide? Or does not knowing lead to suicide prevention? So there's been some research that shows that 25% of people with Huntington's consider suicide when they know when they have it, and 10% carry it out, which is much higher than the typical prevalence of suicide in people who don't have Huntington's. So, should we be giving these tests out so that once people have the results that they're probably not prepared for, what do they do with that information? So you become worried about the potential for suicide. But is preventing suicide an adequate reason for not testing? Even if some percent, in this case 10%, commit suicide or successfully commit suicide, the majority won't. Suicide isn't unreasonable. It should be something that should be considered and should be talked about as a result of the genetic testing. And that leads to the concept of genetic counseling. And really, none of this genetic testing shouldn't be happening or should be happening without genetic counseling. That's really important because there are many people who are just not prepared for this information that they're receiving. So it should come with some degree of genetic counseling to go along with it. They have to have information. They have to be made available, specific resources, etc. The other issue, ethical issue with this topic is insurance. And this raises a huge ethical issue because there was one case in 2000 where a woman had a preventative radical mastectomy, similar to what Angelina Jolie did, and she had fear that her insurance company would cancel her policy if they knew her reasons for having the double mastectomy. And that was a typical issue with, or concern, before the Affordable Care Act, when you could be dropped from insurance companies for pre-existing conditions, and these genetic testing situations allowed for evidence that a pre-existing condition existed. So, there was a huge fear about getting the genetic testing done and then being able to be dropped from insurance. Congress passed the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act in 2008, which banned insurers from using knowledge about a person's genes to determine eligibility for insurance or rates of premiums, or for employers from using the same for basis of hiring, firing, or assigning jobs. The genetic testing was also a concern. This is one of the debates that has gone on about the genetic testing companies like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, that sometimes this information could be used in ways that insurers would be able to use or jobs would be able to use, etc. So this legislation said that it can't be used for those kind of situations. There's lots of money to be made from genetic testing as well. It's very expensive. These companies are preying on people's hope, fear of getting something. So they've engaged in a lot of marketing. The cost has increased exponentially. Many of the people who are getting the testing done are the ones who are least likely to develop any of these genetic diseases, and yet they're the ones that are paying the money for this testing. Lots of marketing money is going into genetic testing companies. Companies like the Ancestry.coms and the 23andMe's and those are profiting from having the genetic component. I'll admit, I had my 23andMe done. I got the genetic testing report in addition to the Ancestry report that gives you X number of genetic conditions, and do you have the gene that predisposes you to developing that particular disorder.